In one of the most respected universities in the country, Dr. Linda Markham was a well-known professor of advanced calculus. She had a reputation for her sharp mathematical skills, but also for her strong political opinions, which she frequently brought into her lectures. Her class was not just about numbers and equations. It had become a place where she often mixed academics with discussions about social issues. That particular morning, students walked into the large lecture hall expecting to see a complex equation already written on the whiteboard, as was the norm. But today was different. Instead of math problems, there was a message in bold letters. Today's topic: redefining academic priorities. The students exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. It wasn't going to be a day of calculus, but a discussion about societal issues. At the back of the room, a tall, quiet young man sat, with perfect posture in his black suit. He didn't speak much, didn't engage in casual conversations, and preferred to keep to himself. But despite his reserved nature, everyone in the class knew exactly who he was: Barron Trump. What they didn't know was that he was about to shock the entire room. Dr. Markham started the lecture, but there was a noticeable difference in her tone. She wasn't just teaching, she was making a statement. She walked back and forth across the front of the room, speaking with a sense of authority. "Mathematics is important," she began, "but we need to make room for more pressing social conversations. We must shift our focus to real-world applications, especially regarding social justice." Some students nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Barron, however, remained still. He listened carefully, his face calm and unreadable. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. The professor hesitated. She had not expected anyone to question her today. She ignored him at first, continuing her speech about privilege and how wealth and connections create unfair advantages in education. As she spoke, she looked in Barron's direction more than once, making it clear who her words were aimed at. Yet, his hand remained raised. His patience never wavered. Finally, she could no longer ignore him. "Yes?" "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice carrying a mix of amusement and irritation. "Do you have something to add to our discussion about privilege in education?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew about Barron's perfect test scores. They had seen him quietly helping other students in the library. But now, for the first time, they were about to hear him speak in class. He lowered his hand and began to speak with a measured, respectful tone. "Dr. Markham, I believe calculus is essential for understanding both theoretical and applied sciences. Many of us chose this course to deepen our knowledge in mathematics. Wouldn't reducing our core curriculum harm all students, regardless of their background?" A few students nodded in agreement. Dr. Markham's expression hardened. "Mr. Trump," she said pointedly, "you, of all people, should understand how privilege affects education. Not everyone had access to private tutors and elite prep schools." Instead of reacting defensively, Barron simply smiled. "You're right, Professor. I have been fortunate in my education," he said, "which is why I believe we should maintain high academic standards so that every student has the opportunity to reach their full potential." A flicker of irritation crossed the professor's face. "And you think you know better than your professor about academic standards?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Barron remained calm. "I don't claim to be an expert," he replied. "I'm just a student who loves mathematics and believes that it should transcend political differences." He gestured toward the whiteboard. "Instead of debating privilege, shouldn't we be solving complex calculus problems?" The room fell silent again. Dr. Markham narrowed her eyes. Then, with a smirk, she picked up a marker. "Very well, Mr. Trump," she said, turning to the board. "If you are so passionate about mathematics, Let's put your skills to the test." She began writing an equation. As she worked, murmurs spread through the room. This wasn't a simple calculus problem. It was the kind of advanced mathematics that even graduate students would struggle with. When she was done, she stepped back and turned to Barron with a confident expression. "Since you care so much about academic excellence," she said, "why don't you solve this for us?" A few students exchanged uneasy glances. They could tell that this was meant to embarrass him. Barron stood up and walked toward the board. He studied the equation for a moment, then picked up the marker. "Before I begin," he said, turning to the class, "would you like to see the standard solution? Or would you prefer a more efficient approach based on Leibniz's original papers?" Dr. Markham's confident expression faltered. "You've read Leibniz's original papers?" she asked. "Yes," Barron replied. "In German. The translations don't quite capture the elegance of his methodology." The room was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Then, Barron turned to the board and began solving the problem. He worked with precision, his steps clear and logical. As he solved each part, he explained his thought process. "This first step," he said, "uses a technique developed by Euler in 1755. It simplifies what appears complex into something more approachable." Students leaned forward, intrigued. Even those who struggled with calculus found themselves understanding his explanation. Finally, he reached the last step. "Now," he said, "we could proceed with the traditional method, but Leibniz's insights allow for a more elegant conclusion. Which approach would you like to see, Professor?" Dr. Markham stood, frozen. The smugness in her expression had vanished. Before she could answer, a quiet voice from the middle of the class spoke up. "Could we see both?" asked Sarah Chen, one of the more reserved students. "This is actually helping me understand last week's material better." Barron smiled at Sarah, then looked at Dr. Markham expectantly. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, the classroom door burst open. A faculty member walked in. "Dr. Markham," he announced, "there's an emergency faculty meeting about the new curriculum changes." Dr. Markham took the opportunity to step away. "We will have to continue this discussion another time," she said quickly. But Barron wasn't about to let her walk away so easily. "Professor," he said, his voice steady, "you challenged me to solve this problem in front of everyone." Walking away now would set a poor example for academic integrity. The class murmured in agreement. Dr. Markham hesitated, realizing that in challenging Barron, she had inadvertently proved his point: merit should always come before bias. The only question left was, would she accept her own challenge? The tension in the room was overwhelming. Several students had already taken out their phones, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. Dr. Markham looked trapped between her own past statements and the reality unfolding before her. The dean, standing nearby, appeared unsure whether to step in and assert his authority or remain silent and see what would happen next. Then, something unexpected happened. Barron, rather than pressing his advantage, simply held out the marker to Dr. Markham. With a calm yet knowing smile, he said, "Or perhaps you'd prefer to show us the solution first? After all, as you mentioned earlier, family connections shouldn't matter. Only knowledge should. And as our professor, surely you can solve this problem you've assigned to us." The room went completely silent. Every pair of eyes in the classroom was fixed on Dr. Markham as she stared at the marker in her hand. It was only then that she seemed to fully grasp the trap she had walked into. The presence of the dean, which might have felt like a safety net before, now only served as another witness to what was about to unfold. Dr. Markham's fingers tightened around the marker until her knuckles turned white. The dean shifted uncomfortably. What had started as a classroom discussion had escalated into something much bigger. The students remained motionless, their phones still recording, understanding that this was no ordinary moment, it was a turning point. Dr. Markham began, but then she stopped. Her hand trembled slightly as she looked at the complex equation on the board. It was the same equation she had deliberately chosen, hoping to embarrass a student. Now it felt like a sword hanging over her own head. Barron spoke again, but his voice carried no arrogance, only sincerity. "Maybe we can solve it together," he suggested. "Sometimes collaboration leads to a better understanding." His tone was free of mockery, his expression free of triumph. He was offering to turn this moment of conflict into something productive. But Dr. Markham's pride wouldn't allow her to take the lifeline. "This is absurd," she snapped, tossing the marker onto the desk. "This entire display is nothing more than a privileged student trying to undermine my authority." The dean quickly stepped in, trying to regain control. "Let's all take a step back." "No," Barron interrupted firmly, picking up the marker. "Let's take a step forward." With steady hands, he turned to the board and began writing. In just a few minutes, he flawlessly completed not one, but two solutions, both the traditional method and an alternative approach proposed by Lai. By the time he wrote the final line, the class broke into spontaneous applause. Even the dean looked impressed, unable to hide his astonishment. But what happened next would change everything, not just for this class, but for the entire department. Dr. Markham's face had lost its color. She looked as though she was watching everything she had carefully built crumble before her eyes. But Barron wasn't done. What he said next would prove that real leadership isn't about winning arguments, it's about building bridges. He turned to face Dr. Markham and the dean. "The beauty of mathematics," he said, "is that it doesn't care about politics, backgrounds, or biases. It only cares about the truth." He gestured toward the equations on the board. "These solutions don't just teach us about calculus, they teach us about learning itself. When we let our personal biases cloud our judgment, we miss opportunities to grow." The dean cleared his throat. "Mr. Trump, while your mathematical abilities are impressive, you must understand that a voice from the back of the room interrupted. Are you saying we should learn less math because of someone's political agenda?" It was Michael Chen, a scholarship student who rarely spoke up. More students stood. "I came here to learn calculus," one said firmly. "Not to be judged for my background." Dr. Markham's control over the class was slipping. The dynamic had shifted completely. But before she could say anything, Barron did something unexpected. He chose to help rather than humiliate. "Professor," he said, his voice steady but respectful, "your knowledge of mathematics is extensive. I've learned a lot from your lectures. Maybe we could focus on that. I'd be happy to assist students after class combining your theoretical expertise with practical problem solving." The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't out of tension. It was the weight of the moment, the realization that this was a way forward. The dean watched carefully, understanding that what happened next could turn this into a major scandal or a major breakthrough. Dr. Markham hesitated, looking at her students, really looking at them. Perhaps for the first time. And what she saw made her come to a decision that changed everything. Her voice was quiet at first. She began, then straightened her posture. "I made a mistake." The admission seemed to cost her, but there was something different in her tone, something more genuine. "For years I've been so focused on fighting against privilege that I became exactly what I claim to stand against, someone who judges others unfairly." She turned to Barron. "You didn't just solve that equation. You taught me something about real leadership." The dean saw an opportunity. Perhaps this could be a model for other departments. But before he could spin this into an administrative win, noise erupted outside the classroom. A crowd had gathered in the hallway, students from other classes, drawn by the viral videos spreading online. Some held makeshift signs reading, "Teach math, not politics and merit over bias." The situation was on the verge of spiraling out of control. Once again, Barron took action. He walked to the door and addressed the growing crowd. "If you're here to learn," he said, his voice steady, "then come in. There's plenty of room." Students poured into the classroom, filling every available space. Dr. Markham watched, stunned, as Barron turned back to the board, marker in hand. "Now," he said, "who wants to learn about real-world applications of calculus?" What happened over the next hour would become university legend. But the real impact wasn't just about solving equations. It was about transforming a culture. Word spread across campus, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of a story about conflict and humiliation, it became a story about growth and collaboration. Attendance in the advanced calculus class tripled. Students weren't just there for math. They were there to witness something special, a classroom where merit truly mattered, where learning was the priority, and where people could change for the better. Dr. Markham, humbled by her experience, returned to her true passion, teaching mathematics. Barron, true to his word, led study sessions that bridged the gap between theory and practical application. One day, as Barron helped a struggling student with a concept, Dr. Markham approached him. "You know," she said quietly, "you could have destroyed my career that day. Instead, you helped save it." She hesitated, then added, "Your father would be proud." Barron smiled. "The goal was never to tear anyone down, Professor. It was to lift everyone up." That calculus class became a symbol, a reminder that real education isn't about power struggles or politics. It's about knowledge, fairness, and the courage to stand up for what's right in the right way. And Barron? He still sits in the back of the class. He still helps struggling students. And he still believes that the greatest privilege of all is the opportunity to learn and to help others do the same.